Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to Base Day F. You know me, I'm sociologist Ashley Frawley. With me today, I have D.L. Jacobs returning for the final part of a series on classical political economy and why it matters. So, can you tell me where we are at the moment in terms of the argument that you're trying to sort of piece together?
Yes, the last time when we were talking about political economy, we kind of left off with the debate between, I'm going to say, the Ricardians and the Malthusians about the nature of value. And we led into that by first talking about the role of Adam Smith and his Rousseauian interest, even preoccupations, his infatuation, even at times with Rousseau, regarding political economy. Economics has always existed. People have known about things. Obviously, people have used different laborers in some way and said, well, they should be used in a division of labor because it's more efficient than something else. But what Adam Smith is the self-consciousness of in the 18th century is the kind of revolution in the cosmos of humanity. That what looks like a commercial society, because of course commerce has always existed, is really the expression of the transformation of all of humanity, a kind of higher interdependence, a higher freedom. And just to emphasize, higher interdependence and higher freedom also means greater responsibility and also the possibility of greater problems than could maybe really happen in ancient society. Meaning Adam Smith is very much aware that if one doesn't have, if they don't work, for example, not in the classical sense of, tilling the land and, raising your kids, but in terms of working as a wage laborer, that you would not be able to feed yourself. So greater freedom also means all of the bourgeoisie are very, aware of this, the potential, the freedom to starve, actually, in a way that was different than, you could say the unfreedom to starve of traditional society was one of bad harvests and wars, meaning we also create the possibility that people could starve because of problems that are socially produced. And what we were leaving off with regarding Ricardo and Malthus basically was that they were trying to make sense of Adam Smith. They wouldn't put it like that, of course, because they understand themselves as progressing on Adam Smith, but the kind of antinomy and value that David Ricardo said, well, value in the final instance is really the labor applied. And value, again, is not an economic term or reducible to economics. It's a social category, meaning your ability to count in society is related to how you fit into the division of labor, how you fit into the social organization of society. Whereas Malthus, while he might have seemed to be regressing to something pre-Adam Smith, seemed to also pick up on the fact that most of what's happening in society is not independent laborers getting together and working, but rather that they do so under the circumstances of capitalist production. And so that's why for Malthus, he emphasizes that no, value is the amount of labor that something can attain or exchange for in society, which maybe that seems kind of banal. But what that plays out to mean is that it's the amount that one can receive in exchange for labor, which is more than simply paying the laborer. It's also the profit and rent. So both Ricardo and Smith are taking different sentences and passages from Adam Smith. And this crisis in political economy, for someone later like Marx, that's not a thought mistake. It's not a bunch of academics who are just, they have their heads up their derrieres, so to speak. It's actually expressing a real contradiction in reality. So, if we remember, I feel like a lot of, and let me just say something about the stakes as well. Political economy as the self-consciousness of bourgeois society, we are free to the degree that we know we're free, and to the degree that we can recognize our activity so political economy was, on the one hand, a kind of war cry of the bourgeoisie against the traditional society. All of the terms that we hear today from all the socialists were already said by political economy. Oh, you're exploiting my labor, you're oppressing my being. All of those can be found in Adam Smith. Adam Smith has a critique of imperialism. But beyond that, a crisis in political economy, if that was a basis for recognizing our new freedom, that all are free, to quote Hegel, which is something he's getting from Adam Smith, meaning we're all merchants, is kind of the way that Adam Smith puts it. We all are property owners in a way that in the ancient world, only a few were property owners, or maybe only one was a property owner. That a crisis in political economy, you have to think about the identity between how we reflect on things and what is existing in social practice. And so the crisis in political economy is really a reflection of a crisis in social practice. So what I wanted to say about this is I feel like my feeling is that most people who, I'm just going to put it as, identify with Marx in some way. It doesn't have to be that they agree with everything Marx says, but are like into Das Kapital and reading the Grundrisse and these kind of economic works. I feel like most of them tend to side with, say, Ricardo against Malthus, whether consciously or unconsciously. And that's because a lot of us who are interested in Marx in some way or another have some kind of habit of fighting, the bourgeois apologist who says something like value is subjective. It's your utility, it's in the market, it's exchange. They seem to deny this basic truth that value is only produced by labor. I've just have listened to debates of like someone who will identify as a socialist or communist versus a libertarian, and half the time the term value, people are just talking past each other. And the reason I bring this up is I want to say that this kind of antinomy between Malthus and Ricardo, that Ricardo is emphasizing labor as it's the labor applied as the basis for value, and Malthus is emphasizing the labor that can be exchanged for as the basis of value, that this is a real antinomy, not a thought mistake. And we can think as well, there's a kind of famous passage from Marx in the Grundrisse about capital as a moving contradiction, that both Malthus and Ricardo were right, and this is why it's contradictory, that capital is simultaneously positing labor time, it's positing bourgeois society, that's what it really means, meaning it's positing a society of the cooperation of labor, and then it's also undermining that and actually reproducing itself as the kind of denial of labor. So if people are familiar with kind of young Marx talking about the more you produce, the less you are, this kind of language that maybe seems romantic and it gets attacked by libertarians as Marx is like an ascetic or he doesn't care about modern society or something. Actually, what Marx is saying is something very precise. He's saying that the old bourgeois view, the John Locke view, that property follows from labor, from mixing your labor, that the more you produce, the more you have. Marx is just kind of voicing that it's the opposite. That what seems to happen after the Industrial Revolution, and this is what's giving rise to Ricardo and Malthus's antinomy, is no longer is bourgeois society able to understand itself, right? It can't kind of line up that the more you produce, the more you are. It seems like maybe the opposite is true. Especially as we'll talk about today regarding some of the Ricardian socialists, in the wake of the French Revolution, really the Napoleonic Wars, in England, this is going to be the kind of ground of the Ricardian socialism today, people see idle factories and idle labor, right? Unemployment and idle factories. And this kind of problem seems unlike something that really ever existed in the 18th century or even hitherto, that we have too many people, but it's not too many people in terms of a poor harvest. We actually have a glut of food and also too many people. And there's some kind of interrelationship between those. And so the intelligibility of labor as the basis of modern society that Adam Smith could dialectically develop that's dropping out. And Ricardian socialism for Marx is a symptom of that. And not just a symptom in like, I don't know, people are angry. It's actually saying something about the opportunity to overcome capitalism. Obviously, right now, there's a lot of problems in the world. And it seems like problems happen, and then the best we have to do is kind of pressure our governments to try to enact something to kind of change things. It's very bureaucratic and very Bonapartist. And for Marx, his interest in political economy was always a political question, that the working classes were politicizing political economy, right? You kind of get this in the Communist Manifesto. They turn the weapons of the bourgeoisie against the bourgeoisie, which is also a liability, meaning they are bourgeois weapons. And yet for Marx, the practical necessity of a critique of political economy was that the proletariat, in organizing itself, was actually organizing the crisis of society, was organizing capitalism. The proletariat, as a young Marx puts it, is the disintegration of society, such that its consciousness of itself, when it actually even is saying it's against society, that it's actually bearing the contradiction of society. And it points to the kind of problem that capitalism is for Marx, just to put the stakes of it, which is it's not that a bunch of bad people run the world and exploit the poor and the salt of the earth. Really, in the final instance, Marx is saying, actually, the working class is exploiting itself, ultimately, which might seem insane because people think of themselves individually as workers or even as groups and think, how am I exploiting myself? I'm dependent on any job I might get, right? You can think of all sorts of songs. I live in Pennsylvania, so there's like a Billy Joel song, Allentown, right? We're living here in Allentown, but all the jobs have moved away. How can you say that the working class is exploiting itself? Because the working class is reproducing the problem, not out of malice, not out of bad intentions, but out of desperation. And yet, in doing so, for Marx, in their struggle to survive out of necessity, in grouping themselves into parties, into unions, civil society organizing, they've actually manifested the problem, the contradiction, the self-contradiction of society, such that they're pointing towards its overcoming. So the reason I constantly emphasize that value is not an economic category, that's fine, I guess, if people want to say that. But the real point is that value in the final instance is being demanded by the working class, right? The unemployed, the only thing worse than being exploited is to not be exploited at all, to quote Joan Robinson.
I feel like it kind of sounds like often you hear down the line, this becomes a critique of social reproduction where, the working class, they reproduce, but it's sort of culturalized. They reproduce capitalism through social reproduction. So really, they're sort of complicit in the perpetuation of this terrible system because of how they socialize their children to become workers, this sort of thing. And it sounds to me, if that I hear echoes of this, that maybe perhaps some sociologists took this basic kind of understanding of the reproduction of capitalism through the workers and turned it into a kind of cultural philosophy. But what would you say to something like that?
Right. So I would say that because we reproduce it, it can also be overcome. Right. So this is why, why doesn't Marx have like a critique of the capitalists? Because in a sense, they've never organized themselves in a way that renders the problem conscious. There's a great aphorism by Max Horkheimer called The Little Man, the Philosophy of Freedom, where he starts off by saying, well, of course, the capitalist is subject to capitalism. They're subject to booms, busts, business cycles, inflation. He says, even the qualities of things and men, meaning that the capitalists are members of society, they're subject to the same cultural production and everything like that. of course, it sounds like what you're saying is that someone makes a moral judgment about it, meaning they say capitalism is reproduced because of the moral dearth of the working class, that they lack education or morality and need to be tutelaged to do something better and not reproduce these bad things. And actually, it's interesting you bring that up because in the 18 teens and 1820s in England, there were plenty of middle class reformers who thought that's what you had to do. So someone like Simon Gray, for example, or the editors of the Edinburgh Review, they were like, or someone like Nassau Senior, who Marx has a whole section on in Capital. They were like, we need to teach the working class about the basics of political economy so that they chill, like that they calm down and stop breaking machines and attacking us and putting all the blame on the entrepreneurs of society, like whatever kind of Ayn Randian thing. What I would say to the kind of cultural sociologist view is that, of course, culture is produced, and that culture is also a means of integrating and adapting people to society. There's a necessity to it. And in reproducing something, that also means it can become self-conscious of itself. So I know what it sounds like to people, perhaps. I don't want to ever, I'm just allowing for this to be the case, to say that the working class is reproducing its exploitation, that it's reproducing class society. That's also the opportunity for overcoming class society. So it's not that they reproduce their exploitation at the level of groups or cohorts or like cities or towns or something. They reproduce it at the class level. But class is a category of society in total, right? It's all of society. I know, Ashley, right now with the sublation group, you guys had just read Rousseau's General Will, on the social contract, but I was thinking of the phrase general will. The general will for Marx is the class struggle for Marx is the self-contradiction of the general will of society, right? There's a passage in the Communist Manifesto, in present society, the past dominates the present. And of course, that's self-contradictory because the past is preserved through the present as well, right? Meaning, why is it that we don't just begin all over again? Well, we have civilization, we preserve the past, we're born into the world with all sorts of developments of thousands and thousands of years of development that are nature to us as much as my instincts are nature. I think we talked about this the first time. So class for Marx, actually, this leads into something else I was going to talk about. So let me make also, if I do this correctly today, I'll make a pitch for the sisters to what I was going to talk about with political economy, which is also this question of class and this question of materialism. But class for Marx, he's getting the idea of history as the history of class struggle from all of the liberals and bourgeoisie that come out of like the French Restoration. He says this in a letter to Joseph Weidemeyer, where he says, well, if you want to know where the theory of class struggle comes from, go read Thierry, Guizot. He mentions a guy named John Wade. He even mentions Ricardo as well, to be like, even Ricardo is kind of thinking of class here. And the reason I bring that up is that in the kind of classic liberal view of class, which is really a 19th century phenomenon, it's not quite there in the 18th century. The history of class struggles meant that society developed, new potentials emerged, new forces of production, and those forces of production changed social interest. And then the political struggles that played out, at the top of society were actually expressing social interest undergirding society. This is a view that comes out of someone like Thierry and Francois Guizot. So Augustin Thierry was the quote-unquote adopted son of a famous socialist named Henri de Saint-Simon, who basically taught Thierry this view of history of the development of forces and relations of production. If that sounds familiar, as that is usually associated with Marx, it was said before he was born, almost 2 decades before he was born. And for Saint-Simon, he was like, well, in the Middle Ages, the lords were the industrial productive people that they kind of directed, actually even before the Middle Ages, at like the 5th century, they directed the peasants on agriculture. And then eventually through, I'm not going to go through the whole history, I probably have to come back on and talk about it later. They basically gave rise to a greater potential in society, the forces of production, and that required new relations. That gives birth to like absolute monarchy. And likewise, what Saint-Simon is then saying at the time of the French Revolution is we're on the cusp of a new society. So this Marxist view that, or this ostensibly Marxist view that society gives rise to new potentials, alien powers as we got from Rousseau, and that politics is not gang warfare. It's not just different people fighting over the throne, but is actually reflecting civil society. It's an extremely bourgeois idea, very bourgeois, super bougie bourgeois idea, liberal class struggle, to such a degree that the libertarians who are kind of in the know about this, because they really like Augustin Thierry and someone like Benjamin Constant as a kind of classical liberal is the way they would put it. They actually accuse Marx of plagiarizing the liberals. They go, well, the liberals had the right class theory, and then Marx comes along and does this demagoguery by then treating the bourgeoisie as if they're a new class. Not quite. Actually, what Marx is doing is he's picking up on the fact that the working class is actually reproducing the liberal view of class struggle under the changed conditions of the Industrial Revolution. Meaning, someone like Auguste Blanqui, who is a communist, who calls himself a proletarian at his defense trial in January 1832, he says, well, we have 3 classes in society. We have the feudal lords, we have the bourgeoisie, and we have the people. Now, if you were to say this in the 18th century, that would be unintelligible. Like if you were to say this to Adam Smith, who we were talking about last week, he's like, oh, the people are the burghers. It's the city folk. And if you were to say this to Abbé Sieyès at the start of the French Revolution, he would say, well, the third estate are the people, right? Those who work. And so the reason I bring that up is that, of course, for Marx, the fact that the working class was actually treating itself as a proletariat, meaning they were calling themselves this, they were forming themselves into a class, they were forming themselves into a party, they were demanding democracy. It's an expression of the symptom of society, of liberal society. Democracy was a means to the end in the French Revolution of emancipating civil society. That you can think of the famous tennis court oath when the third estate is locked out of the National Assembly, so goes to the tennis court and says, we're going to submit ourselves and only hold ourselves. They kind of take an oath of the nation, right? So these are the people. We hold ourselves according to law and not according to man, which would have been meant as arbitrary rule of the king. For Marx, that same revolt of the third estate is replaying out through the workers, and they're repeating the old bourgeois the old liberal understandings. The workers are bourgeois. We should just be clear about that. They're repeating the old liberal understandings under the changed conditions of the Industrial Revolution. It's why Marx says in the letter to Ruge, the famous ruthless criticism of everything that exists in 1843, when we get down to it, we'll realize that communism is not a new task, but the work of the old world. So coming back to the question of the stakes of this, it's not about Marx being like, I'm with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, because that's actually a kind of misrecognition of society. And because it's a misrecognition, it's liable to drive the crisis of society onwards and onwards, which is what Marx and Engels experience in 1848, where the statification of society comes out of the demand for democracy. This is also related to Marx's critique of political economy, meaning the proletariat, citizens without property, they can't realize themselves in civil society, so they democratically demand Louis Bonaparte to provide industry or provide unemployment insurance, which is, a big thing related to Bismarck in Germany. They're actually statifying society because they're trying to realize the value of their labor. They're trying to realize themselves as persons. But what is the state doing, actually? It's trying to preserve and maintain the very society in crisis. So this is why I think I just heard Spencer on some podcast the other day, Spencer Leonard, and he's like, yeah, the state is capitalism. Because I know people think capitalism means the economy. No. I wish it was that straightforward. No, it's the crisis of society, and the state is the kind of blaring truth of that, or the blaring untruth of society, to go into something else. So Marx gives a kind of critique of why is it that the class struggle is being repeated under the kind of changed conditions of the Industrial Revolution? Why are the workers kind of bringing back the old liberal idea? And what does that also mean? Is it just like, a fever dream, or is there a way in which it points beyond itself? Let me just stop there because I know I went in a tangent, but I just wanted to make sure that made sense.
Yeah, I feel like one thing that might be worth explaining a bit more is you say this phrase a lot, the crisis of society. What does that mean when you say that?
When we were talking about Adam Smith last week and the division of labor and the greater interdependence of society, the greater interdependence of modern society from traditional society, we hold each other to social relations that kind of didn't exist in ancient society. And we have a greater freedom, but also greater responsibility through them. Like freedom and responsibility are related. And what I mean by that as well is that if those social relations come to be inadequate for their object, so the simple way of saying this is that the Industrial Revolution makes the exchange of labor time inadequate to capture the potential of industrial society. That industrial society, the Industrial Revolution, is beyond relating to someone as a butcher, baker, and the candlestick maker, to quote Adam Smith. The way in which people experience this is not just like a computer program breaking down. They experience it as if there's something wrong in society and that people are being robbed. So very young Marx puts it that the realization of labor is now experienced as a loss. So all the Ricardian socialists that we'll talk about in a bit, they're not saying that the capitalist is doing something that leads to a market crisis. They're saying capital is a fiction. It's a Kabbalistic word, to quote Thomas Hodgkin, who's my avatar here. It's a made-up word. It's a usurpation. It's a violation of the rights of humanity and unnatural. It's wrong. And if you think back to just basic John Locke, where he's like, the law of nature is the law of self-preservation. Why is it that if somebody breaks into my house, I can fight them off, even kill them, in fact, because they have violated my natural rights? And so the reason I bring that up in terms of like, why is it a crisis? Not only is there this technical reason, but it actually leads to the internecine warfare of society. The class struggle for Marx, it's not a good thing for him. It's a symptom of the fact that both sides accuse the other side of being criminal, of being wrong. I mean, imperialism, this is like a thing in the world. I'll quote Lenin from 1917. This might be a surprise for people. Lenin is like, the imperialist war is not the fault of any capitalists or any group of capitalists, and yet it's being fought in the interest of capital, right? So all of the slaughter and murder and deaths for Lenin, what is imperialism? It's not the machinations of evil warmongers. It's a crisis of society that different nation states are trying to manage. And actually, society is beyond any nation state. It's the entire world. It's, I guess, the moon right now, because we have people up there as well. And so the crisis by which we judge what is right and wrong, right? Like, in other words, it's not that morality doesn't exist, but in judging who is responsible, the crisis of society means actually that very measure of what is right and wrong itself becomes inadequate, right? What's happening in World War I, it's not the fault, like from a kind of legalistic perspective, it looks like, okay, Germany invades first, therefore they're responsible. But from the Marxist perspective, the entire world is socialized. And so it's not like you can simply say Germany is fighting to maintain German capital, because in all of the German businesses are also British and French capital. It's socialized production, right? Capital in the final instance requires the entire world, right? I don't know, China and the US right now are having some Cold War or something like that. And yet, obviously, China and the US are two major trading nations that are totally socialized, that presuppose each other in even building a pencil, right? The most basic commodities, or even feeding people. The entire, this is related to the Trump phenomena. The entire feeding of declassed workers in the Rust Belt has presupposed cheap goods from China, believe it or not. Not just that people might not have jobs anymore, and that's a debatable thing about the magnitude of what's called the China shock, to quote David Autor, but also that you can feed people who are partially employed, that China is a major export nation. Like, the whole thing is capitalism. It's capitalism is the pathology of modern society. And so I don't know if I answered that sufficiently or not, but the point is, the very basis by which I even judge who is responsible, who is human, what is my property, what is my activity in society, itself is disintegrating. And so all these things that Marx experiences in 1848, that society seems to fall into one pseudo-pretender, Louis Bonaparte, like, this is the meaning behind Bonapartism. It's not that Louis Bonaparte is some demagogue, right? Like, people like to talk about Bonapartism when it's Donald Trump, but not Barack Obama, because a lot of the left just hails the Democrats. It's actually, for Marx, the expression of the crisis of society as it's falling into dependency upon one pseudo-pretender, upon Louis Bonaparte. It's demanding, it's democratically demanding that he kind of dole out things, right? The whole aim of classic bourgeois society was to have a self-regulating civil society, right? All the ideas that are associated with Marx, the withering away of the state, no, that's already there with John Locke. And if you don't believe John Locke, it's there with Adam Smith. And if you don't believe Adam Smith, it's there with Saint-Simon. Meaning, Saint-Simon says the state will wither away from each according to their need, each according to their ability. That comes out of Saint-Simon. Marx just appropriates all of these things, their kind of meaning. And the reason I bring that up is that the recrudescence of this state in 1848 and the growth of the state, and even the left praising the growth of the state, progressivism, right? All of these things, like, people just assume the left are like radical progressives or something. How dare you talk about civil society? What are you, a right-wing libertarian? That all of these things are the untruth of society. They show that civil society is a sham, not in that it was made up by people to trick the masses, but that it's become contradictory. It's become hypocritical in practice. That we're kind of compelled to relate as if we were the butcher and the baker. And then what we set in motion in relating is something that goes far beyond the exchange of labor time. This is the truth of Malthus, by the way. Of course, he does it to apologize for sinecures and things like that. But what we set in motion, capital, is beyond what can be captured by the measure of people in bourgeois society. Social relations are a measure. They relate unlike things, they reduce them to something, right? Whenever I would talk to undergrads about economics, I would say, what does a gallon of milk and a Mercedes Benz have in common? And people would think of all sorts of things. I don't know, nitrogen or something. They would just start thinking of chemical compounds. But then eventually someone would say, well, they all have a price. And if they all have a price, they're all property. And if they're all property, then one asks, what is the basis of that property? It's labor. And so maybe turning to the question of the Ricardian socialists, what the Ricardian socialists are trying to make sense of is why bourgeois society, which treats everybody as a laborer, everybody is a laborer. Bill Gates is a laborer. All property presupposes labor. Why that seemed to be incongruous with reality, right? That they would look out and the kind of inalienable rights of man, your property and yourself, seem to be violated by the unemployed, right? That the unemployed could not realize the most basic right in bourgeois society. And I'll just say this about John Locke. For John Locke, the idea of a worker without the means of production was a political invention that ought to have no recourse except for revolution, right? Meaning the idea for John Locke is that if you've been expropriated by your means of production, right, your ability to produce yourself, then basically what has happened is somebody has violated your natural rights. You are in the so-called natural state of things, or the state of nature, and there is no morality anymore. It's simply survival. In other words, the workers can claim, I have a right to work, and if you keep this from me, I can fight you, right? Like this is the deep basis of political economy. It's not people looking at the economy and saying, when is the business cycle going to dip down, or are we going to get inflation, or where are interest rates going to go? That's far below what political economy is. And actually, right before I say the Ricardian socialists, I just want to talk about some of the also contemporaries of Ricardo who gave historical critiques, and this will lead into the stakes of the Ricardian socialists for Marx. So one of Ricardo's friends is a guy named Simone de Sismondi. And I bring him up because he was like a brilliant historian. Marx mentions him at times, but he doesn't seem to ever give, say, gigantic chapters to dealing with Simone de Sismondi. Now, the reason I bring him up is because he already says a lot of things that are associated with Marx. He already says, well, modern society based on, he calls it commercial wealth, it has no limits. Speaking of the crisis of social relations, it overproduces its measure of value. And because it overproduces this measure of value, it overproduces society. That's what value is. It's a social relation. It destroys society. And this destruction leads to a kind of infinite negative loop. I don't know if negative was used right there, but an infinite self-undermining loop that people overproduce value. And then because everybody kind of produces independently, they try to make up for that. And then that leads to greater overproduction. And this overproduction is basically a kind of dead end of society, meaning Simone de Sismondi already has a crisis theory. And he's a friend of Ricardo, and he kind of is critiquing Ricardo when he does these things. And it's why he ends the intro to his book on political economy from 1815 by saying, Adam Smith was very brilliant and everything, but we've kind of seen the truth of Smith's system, and it doesn't end great, right? It kind of has been an unfortunate outcome. And, this is why Simone de Sismondi is often associated with romanticism, that he kind of wants to go back to pre-bourgeois society. That's not quite true. He's actually just more pessimistic. He thinks the best that can happen are, as he calls it, palliatives, that the state can step in and help the laboring poor from totally falling into oblivion. But we're kind of stuck in this system that's a dead end, that outstrips what people can naturally consume. and is overproducing society, it's overproducing value, and that this necessarily and inevitably leads to things like crises, falling rates of profit, all of these things. So that's one historical critique. Another historical critique was somebody who replaced Thomas Malthus at his position, which is a guy named Richard Jones. And Richard Jones, like Simone de Sismondi, also gives a historical critique. He's like a very brilliant historian. He's very familiar with the facts and statistics of the East India Company. And what he does, he says, well, the problem with political economy is it's been deductive, meaning people have kind of started from first principles and then kind of deduced what they think are the necessary consequences. He's alluding to people like Say and Ricardo, and I guess Malthus to some degree. And he goes, but when we actually look at the historical facts over the wide trajectory, we see that all of their laws of political economy are in fact very historically specific. And the classic example he gives is Ricardo's theory of rent, that it is the worst quality land that sets the rent. It sets the kind of base value, and then the better quality land, we get a rent off of that. This is, of course, Malthus. This is what we talked about last time. Basically, Richard Jones is like, no, that's a modern law. That has not always existed. It didn't exist when we didn't have a commercial society. I don't have the time to kind of prove everything. I mean, it's a 400-page book, but just know that he kind of runs through and he says, well, it kind of couldn't make sense until now, because the precondition for Malthus and Ricardo's theory of rent, that they treat as natural, basically is capitalist production. And that the rent is that we're producing a surplus value that goes beyond the market return, beyond the expected profit rate. It's a super profit. And that must mean that agriculture itself has been subject to capitalist production, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. Okay. Two other people very quickly. Charles Hull, who in 1805, this book, The Effects of Civilization, he says all sorts of things that are just associated with all of the Ricardian socialists, such as that the poor are exploited, that the effects of civilization are basically to make people poorer and poorer and more wretched. So he's a kind of early utopian socialist. And then, of course, Robert Owen. And Robert Owen, likewise, like similar to Richard Jones, says, well, the Industrial Revolution has undermined Adam Smith's system. There's a great lecture he gives from 1827 where he says the problem with our legislators is they think we're still in the 18th century when Adam Smith's system was adequate and appropriate. But with the Industrial Revolution, production is such that it's outstripped the relation on the basis of labor time. And so we have the opportunity, nay, the necessity, right, because we're suffering from this system going beyond the exchange of labor time, to transform how we live and to realize the potential of industrial society. Now, the reason I mention all of these people before going into Ricardian socialism is because why can't we just stop there, right? Why is it that we can't just take Robert Owen or, Richard Jones and Simone de Sismondi, any of the utopian socialists, I can put Saint-Simon in there as well, who say basically everything that I hear from a lot of the left all the time, who read the Grundrisse and go, well, don't you know, it's value. And the problem is value, and you have to abolish value. And the problem with socialism in the 20th century is it didn't abolish value, it reorganized the distribution of production.
I'm hearing echoes of Doug here, and I won't say myself. I won't own up to that.
No, I mean, we're all in this. I mean, the reason I bring this up is, and all of this is right as well. Like, why is it that yes, we do need to abolish value, but for Marx, the problem with the utopian socialists is they could not give an account of themselves. So basically, someone like Robert Owen or these utopian socialists would say, and by the way, Simone de Sismondi, I think Heinrich Rissman is right in calling him utopian, that they look out at the world, they say, well, capitalism is destroying the value of labor. Why can't we just reconfigure it to emancipate ourselves from that? Like, why can't we just follow through on that logic? You use capitalist production retroactively, as Moishe Postone puts it in his famous Time, Labor, and Social Domination. Why can't we just do that? So this would be considered utopian from Marx because, one, it can't give an account of its own observations, even if they're right. And I feel like I'm going to have to talk a little bit about German idealism in a second to say what's kind of meaningful about that. And so consequently, it's utopian because the is and the ought are sort of placed side by side. It's like, wouldn't it be nice if we just kind of reorganize this? But also, it can't say anything about the truth of its observations. That it just kind of sees it as, this would be a better way of organizing things. It would be great if we didn't suffer from value, right? Meaning, like, when you read Simone de Sismondi, he's like, it would be great if this didn't exist, but it does exist. So what do we do about it?
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.